She was never meant to return, not to the balcony, not to the headlines, not to the story she once broke apart. Yet somehow, Sarah Ferguson always finds her way back. Not through privilege, but persistence. She smiles, she endures, she reappears. For years, she rebuilt herself. Author, advocate, mother, a woman determined to outlive her mistakes. To many, it looked like redemption done right, quiet, humble, earned. But inside the House of Windsor, peace is never simple. Forgiveness has conditions, loyalty has limits. And love, especially for the wrong prince, can be a dangerous kind of devotion. When whispers returned of meetings and familiar closeness, the old unease stirred again. The question wasn't scandal, it was silence. How close is too close to a man the monarchy once forgotten? Fergie's loyalty has always been her light and her flaw. To the public, it feels noble. To the palace, it feels complicated. Because in royal life, compassion can look like rebellion, and even grace comes with a price. She built her redemption on love. But in the monarchy, even love needs permission. As rain gathers on the palace gates, the light inside Windsor flickers, soft, uncertain. History, it seems, is never quite finished with Sarah Ferguson. For more than a decade, Sarah Ferguson lived her life in reconstruction, not through royal privilege, but through sheer endurance. When the palace doors closed, she built her own stage. Television studios, charity galas, book signings, places where she could be seen, not a scandal, but a story. She became the Duchess who refused to vanish. Her reinvention was steady, unglamorous, and strangely human. She spoke openly about mistakes, about money, about survival, subjects no royal had ever treated with such candour. It was both her strength and her risk, because the same honesty that won her sympathy also kept her wounds in public view. There was something deeply British about her resilience, cheerful, self-deprecating, impossible to dislike for long. She learned how to turn embarrassment into empathy, how to face a camera as if it were an old friend rather than an old enemy. Her daughters became her greatest ambassadors. Beatrice and Eugénie, graceful, loyal, and fiercely protective, helped recast her image not through words, but through presence. Family photographs replaced tabloid headlines. Where once there had been scandal, now there was sentiment. The mother redeemed by motherhood itself. It was a quiet narrative, but it worked. For years it seemed Fergie had done the impossible, transformed exile into endurance, mockery into modest relevance. And yet, behind every appearance was calculation. Every interview rehearsed, every smile considered. She knew how quickly sympathy could sour, how easily affection could fade. She had become fluent in the art of second chances. And fluent, too, in the fear of losing them. Fergie's visibility was her victory, but also her trap. She couldn't disappear. She had to keep proving she'd changed. To the public, she was the woman who smiled through ruin. To herself, perhaps, the woman still paying rent on redemption. Her story during those years wasn't glamorous. It was work, constant, visible, exhausting work. An exercise in staying relevant without seeming desperate, grateful without appearing indebted. And though she rarely said it aloud, her endurance carried an unspoken sadness, the knowledge that forgiveness in Britain's most famous family is conditional, and that redemption, once granted, is always on loan. As we see her walking through autumn leaves at Royal Lodge, arm in arm with her daughters, she looks at peace. But in her eyes there's a flicker of something else, the quiet awareness that peace, for her, must always be performed. Behind the polished charm and public grace, there was always a quieter story, one of bills, bargains, and borrowed time. Sarah Ferguson's life, for all its colour and optimism, was rarely secure. Her finances often mirrored her heart, generous, impulsive, and occasionally desperate. Money came and went with the same rhythm as her public affection. A successful deal here, a sudden debt there. Each attempt at independence shadowed by new obligations. She wrote books, launched products, gave talks, fronted campaigns. And yet, beneath the applause, the arithmetic never quite balanced. Her business ventures, spirited, sincere but often short-lived, revealed not greed, but restlessness. A refusal to fade, even when the numbers no longer worked in her favour. Friends described her as kind, open, endlessly giving. Critics called her careless. Perhaps both were right. Her generosity was genuine, but so was her need to be needed. And at the centre of it all stood Prince Andrew. Their marriage ended in paper, but never in practice. They shared a home, holidays, laughter and loyalty that blurred into dependency. She called him her best friend, and meant it. Yet that friendship became the quiet weight she could never put down. When Andrew's public standing collapsed, her loyalty, once seen as grace, began to look like denial. To defend him was to endanger herself. To leave him was to betray her own heart. It is one of royalty's cruelest truths. The very virtues that make them human are the ones that destroy them. Compassion turns to complicity. Devotion becomes debt. Fergie walked that narrow bridge between love and ruin with remarkable calm. Every gesture measured, every silence dissected. She stood beside a man the world had already judged, knowing each photograph would redraw her own. But to her, loyalty was not strategy, it was survival. She had built her second life on forgiveness, and forgiveness, by its nature, cannot be selective. In the quiet of Royal Lodge, the light falls across unopened envelopes and letters signed with too much hope. Outside, the world sees her smile. Inside, there is the soft sound of endurance. A woman mistaking resilience for peace and gratitude for freedom. The Duchess of York remained visible, gracious, composed. But the price of that composure was never hidden. It was written in every pause, every polite nod, every effort not to break. For all her reinvention, Fergie's greatest act was one the world rarely noticed, staying upright when everything around her was built on borrowed grace. It wasn't the grand scandal of the 90s that returned. No photographs, no frenzy, no chaos, just an email, a meeting. A small human moment that carried the weight of a decade trying to forget. The message was polite, even deferential. An offer of access, perhaps, or simply the implication of it. A conversation shaped not by malice, but by need, the kind that grows quietly in the corners of a life rebuilt too many times. For anyone else, it might have been nothing. For Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, it was everything. Because in the shadow of Windsor, intent matters less than optics, and even sincerity can look suspicious in the wrong light. When reports emerged that she had discussed the possibility of introductions, financial relief in exchange for royal connection, the response was immediate and familiar. The sympathy that had taken years to earn began to cool. The press, once kindly nostalgic, rediscovered its old appetite. And the palace, always cautious, returned to its preferred position, distance. There was no public condemnation. There didn't need to be. Silence from the institution speaks louder than words. To her defenders, it was a lapse in judgment, a human mistake, made in a moment of pressure. To her critics, it was confirmation that redemption for Fergie was a cycle rather than a conclusion. The headlines wrote themselves, "The Duchess undone again." But what lingered wasn't outrage. It was fatigue. The weary recognition of a story that refused to change its shape. Even those who once rooted for her began to sigh, not in anger, but in resignation. There was a sadness to it. The sadness of repetition, of a woman perpetually circling her own past. For Sarah Ferguson, the humiliation wasn't in being caught. It was in being predictable, in realising that no matter how many times she rebuilt her name, the ground beneath it was still fragile. Behind the palace walls, dawn light crept through long corridors. Tabloid pages fluttered to the floor, their headlines already fading into yesterday's story. A single phone blinked with unread messages, reminders that privacy for her had long been an illusion. And somewhere in Royal Lodge, the Duchess sat once more between apology and defence, between shame and defiance, knowing that forgiveness, even when granted, is never permanent. How many times, she must have wondered, can one be forgiven for being human? In the months that followed, Sarah Ferguson did what she has always done best. She stepped back with grace. There was no public defence, no lengthy statement. Only silence. A silence that spoke of experience, the kind learned from living too long in the eye of forgiveness. Her presence began to fade from the front pages, replaced by newer stories, newer distractions. But in that retreat, she did not vanish. She simply shifted, from visibility to endurance, from explanation to acceptance. Within the royal circle, her standing changed again. The warmth that had once seemed permanent cooled into careful distance. Invitations became selective, appearances strategic, and yet she remained, not fully inside, not entirely outside, occupying that familiar space between affection and formality. To the public, she became a kind of symbol, the woman who would not stop apologising, who kept returning no matter how many times the door closed. But beneath that narrative of pity was something quieter, sturdier. She never stopped showing up. At funerals, weddings, and family gatherings, she stood with quiet composure. Not demanding attention, not seeking approval, just present. Not as guest nor exile, but as someone who had learned to belong without permission. Her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, remained her compass. Their affection anchored her. Their success softened the story written about her. Through them, she found a new kind of relevance, one that didn't depend on headlines, but on love. And perhaps that was her quiet victory, to remain kind in a world that had rarely been kind to her. To walk through rain, unrecognised but unresentful. To accept that dignity doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it carries an umbrella. In the end, Sarah Ferguson became something the monarchy seldom allows. Ordinary. A woman who failed publicly, forgave privately, and kept moving forward. She had been humiliated, but not broken. Forgotten, but never absent. Inside Windsor, the chapel lights dim after another ceremony. On a mantelpiece, photographs of smiling daughters catch the glow of candlelight. And outside, beneath soft English rain, the Duchess walks home. Unseen, unguarded, but still here. Because even in disgrace, she never left the story. She simply learned how to survive it. In a monarchy built on permanence, Sarah Ferguson became proof that survival is its own kind of royalty. She did not reign, yet she endured through ridicule, redemption, and the slow mercy of time. Her story was never about crowns or ceremony, but about the quiet courage to keep returning when silence would have been easier. Her loyalty to Prince Andrew was both her strength and her undoing. It blurred boundaries, softened scandal, and tested the limits of public sympathy. But in her steadfastness, there was something undeniably human. A defiance born not from rebellion, but from love. Where the institution demands distance, she offered warmth. Where tradition insists on restraint, she gave emotion. To some, it was unbecoming. To others, it was the first honest gesture the monarchy had seen in years. The Duchess of York remains a paradox. A woman who sought redemption not through status, but through connection. She taught, perhaps unintentionally, that grace is not given by the crown. It is earned in the way one survives its weight. Her legacy is not scandal, but endurance. A lesson in how forgiveness, once granted, must still be lived with, quietly, endlessly. And in that endlessness lies both her burden and her brilliance. As night recedes over Windsor, a single candle flickers in a palace window before surrendering to morning light over the Thames. The noise fades, the judgment softens. And what remains is not infamy or innocence, but the simple truth she embodied, that even within royalty, the most lasting power is to remain human.